you here. And Sarah, take it away.
Okay. Hello, my name is Sarah Shannon, and I'm the International Service Director for Bailey's Crossroads Rotary Club. And I would like to welcome each of you to our international talk this evening. The goal was originally to host international dinners each quarter, and with the current pandemic, we have settled on calling this an
Go ahead.
Sorry,
So anyway, so just a few. Okay, so just a few housekeeping items. When the guest speaker begins, everyone will be placed on mute. And I promise you that you will be allowed to ask questions at the end. In the meantime, I would like to welcome each of you to this evening's presentation and appreciate that you're sharing your valuable time with us. A little bit about our guest speaker this evening is Joel Kolker, is the Program Manager for Global Water Security and Sanitation Partnership, and led water supply and sanitation specialist with the World Bank Water Global Practice. He has worked on water, energy, transport, and housing infrastructure finance issues in Africa and Asia for over 35 years. He is currently leading the World Bank Global Water Practice knowledge generation efforts and manages one of the few global think tanks dedicated to water issues. Prior to his current position, he led the water practice efforts to mobilize commercial finance to support water and sanitation infrastructure investments. Before joining the water practice, he worked with a bilateral donor, the World Bank Institute, and the Public-Private Infrastructure Advisory Facility. And he holds a master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Joel.
Thanks very much. I hope you can hear me, and it's certainly an honor to be here. I do a lot of public speaking, but I have to confess, when Sarah asked this, it was a little daunting. I talked to kind of a technical thing, and Sarah asked me to explain a little bit more about myself, a little bit about Africa, and a little bit about water, and it was actually quite a lot of fun putting this together. So I need to thank all of you for this opportunity. Just as further background, Sarah suggested I go into that a little bit more. Very briefly, I was born and raised in New Jersey. I went to school at GW. I did my a year abroad, and that really kind of changed my whole view of this. I was very much a product of the New York metropolitan area. Believed it was the center of the universe and never really thought I would leave, certainly never have this career. I started off after my year abroad, I came back and then did Peace Corps with all of the pros and cons about that. As many people will say, I probably got back more than I gave, but I got very involved in urban planning issues and some water issues as well. I came back for graduate school and then quickly went overseas. Was having a very nice time working on and off in Asia and trekking and swimming and hanging out on beaches, and then got a job offer from USAID, which I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but it's the foreign assistance arm of the US government. And I spent 20 years with them working in Kenya and Indonesia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, mostly on housing and urban development issues. And over time, without any real formal training, I became an expert on finance, or as some people would say, expert on financing infrastructure. I was very involved in a guarantee program. Have probably done about $4 billion worth of infrastructure of investment around, mostly in Africa and Asia, as Sarah said. But over time, I felt USA changed. I always wanted to be a technical person, and the organization was looking more for managers of managers. So at age 48, I left. I took a leave of absence initially and joined the World Bank. I literally left on Friday and started a new job on Monday. I'm not here tonight as a bank employee. I'm really just kind of relaying my experience and my views. Someone once described the World Bank as the most mysterious organization in Washington, D.C. I'm not sure about that. I spent time working in Kenya, South Africa, and Bangladesh, living Kenya, South Africa, and Bangladesh. And I got back to the States after about 27 years of being overseas 4 years ago. The bank has about 15,000 employees. It is a bank. It is a lending institution. Most of the money we lend, you can only borrow from with the Ministry of Finance, and it's highly concessional. We have a global presence, and I've had various jobs in the organization. My job now is to run this think tank. It's associated with a global water practice. We have a portfolio of about $40 billion. We have staff in about 65 countries, and the total staff complement is about 300 people. So that's me. Sarah asked me to talk about Africa a little bit, and I had a lot of fun looking at old pictures, and I was going to show them, and the more I kind of looked at them, the more I realized I kind of want to leave you with a different impression than the pictures. So I'm going to just touch on this very briefly and give you some observations. I think basically this is an impossible topic. Despite over 20 years living in the subcontinent, I make no claim about being an expert. I think contrary to the public perception out there, it's not all bad news. And as someone else has said much smarter than I am, everything you know about Africa is absolutely correct. At the same time, everything you knew about Africa and the subcontinent is dramatically incorrect. You're just dead wrong. And I think that characterizes it pretty well. I don't want to dwell about the negative perceptions here, although I want to be realistic. I'm not going to be an African apologist by any means. But I want to highlight a couple observations. Not surprising, this is a region that's incredibly diverse, not only across the continent, but within certain countries. You have language differences, you have a host of different points, even not in itself, but within specific countries. And the diversity extends from the economies, language, ethnicity, religion, geography, landscape, and the climates that are within the countries. There are microclimates in certain parts of the region that are some of the few only in the world. So the Cape Peninsula, I believe, is one of the few, one of the 8 or 9 microclimates that we have in the world. You certainly can't make generalities about the subcontinent, and then the continent, I should say. It's certainly more complex than that. On one hand, Nigeria and South Africa make up about half of the subcontinent's GDP. It's very large. It's got about 16% of the global population, and it's growing at about 2.7% per annum. It's resource rich in terms of diamonds, gold, oil, natural resources, platinum, copper, and it's up until COVID, and I'll talk a little bit about COVID and the implications in a couple minutes. It was one of the fastest growing regions in the world. It's also fast growing in terms of population. It's estimated that the population will quadruple by the end of this century. It's a very young region. The median age is about 20 years old. Birth rates are in fact falling, and urbanization is very high. It's home to the 10 of the most rapidly growing cities in the world, and the urbanization rate is approaching 50%. So all those beautiful pictures you see of the savannah and the beaches are absolutely accurate, but the teeming cities are equally accurate. Economically, in terms of before the pandemic hit, real income had jumped about 30% over the last decade. There's a growing middle class. According to the African Development Bank, about a third of the population could be considered middle class. However, you need to look more deeply, as with most of this information I'm going to share with you. What that entails is an income of over $39, almost $4,000 per annum. So the basis of what's considered middle class is very, very low. There's a huge diversity in culture. One of the interesting things is Nollywood in Nigeria is the second largest producer of movies by volume in the world. In terms of technology, it has been a center. So mobile banking started in Kenya. In that country alone, access to banking in 2006 was about 14%. Today, it's 85%, and most of that jump has happened in the last 6 or 7 years. So the technology you use for your banking on your phone originated in Kenya with M-Pesa. Social media is booming. It was a region, when I was living in Zimbabwe, we were doing a lot of work with the media. I can't remember the number, but I think newspapers were being read an average of 10 to 15 people per paper. And today you have access across the subcontinent. Internet access remains a problem, but in terms of smartphones and technology, it is all over the subcontinent. And that has huge impacts in terms of the global economy. In terms of that awareness, I'm struck as we're in election season. Back in 2008, when I was living in South Africa, there was a very famous cartoonist who mentioned that the US presidential elections were way too important to leave to the Americans. So I was on a video conference earlier this week at one of the universities, and they were talking about the US presidential election. So you're not as far as you thought you were. When I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I called my parents twice in 2 years. And we have a friend who was a manager in Peace Corps, and people were communicating all the time with relatives in the States. In terms of pre-COVID, some of the fastest growing economies in the world were in Africa. And actually violence and conflict were going down, although there are still real challenges in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Cameroon, Somalia, Chad, Libya, Mali, the north of Mozambique, the north of Uganda, the north of Nigeria. So while it's still one of the poorest regions in the world, there has been considerable growth in GDP as well as per capita. So in terms of COVID itself, the economic, there's the health issue of it. I just want to touch on the economic fallout. It certainly will see Africa hit very hard in both terms of their own economies, but their export potential as a result of the downtime of the economy. So I wanted to leave you with my overall observation rather than any cliches from pictures. The continent is probably not what you think. In fact, it's probably more complex than you imagine, and there's probably more opportunity, yet more complex challenges than you might have imagined. So at the risk of going too fast and jumping around, I'm now going to turn to the topic of water. And I'm going to share my screen for a little while and touch on a couple of things, and then I'm going to turn the screen off. Can everybody see that? Nod your head if you can see that.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Okay, all right. So I'm going to leave you with, I'm going to start off with a couple key messages here. Water is certainly an unrecognized and underappreciation priority. I'm just looking at my screen. I'm noticing that, there we go. Okay, it's certainly an unrecognized and underappreciated priority. We certainly have a water crisis going on, and it's not just in the developing world. We have the resources, the technology, and the knowledge to deal with this crisis. And I don't mean to say simply, because none of this is simple, but we need to reprioritize our objectives, the resources that we're putting into the sector, and perhaps most importantly, our political leadership around this issue. So I'm going to start with some statements that seem kind of silly, but in the spirit of this being very complex, I wanted to define what water is and a couple of other things. So water is not necessarily what you think. I know Rotary is very involved in water and sanitation, and that is one of the areas that I work most prominently in. But even in that, there's different segments of that. You have your bulk water supply at source, you have transmission lines, and then you have the distribution within the local authority in developed economies, but also in rural areas. And those transmission lines, just as an example, can be thousands of kilometers long. So water and sanitation is just one aspect of it. Water resource management, which is upstream at the source of water, is another whole field of the sector. We have people who specialize and look specifically at transboundary water issues. Many of you are aware of the longstanding tension between India and Pakistan on water, and the bank's very involved in that. But more recently, you've had the GERD, which is the development of the major dam in Ethiopia. It's going to have an impact on Sudan and on Egypt. 70% of water resources cut across national boundaries. So the political economy associated with this is huge. I'm going to talk a little bit about water and irrigation, but a preview of that is 70 or 80% of the water that's used in the world is used for agriculture. So water and irrigation is a huge issue. We also do a lot of work on water and economics, and then the financing of water systems is one of the areas that I work in. How it's used, I talked about this, 70 or 80% in agriculture. About 10% is only used by households. That's all. And then the balance is used for manufacturing and industry. Not surprisingly, in the complexity of this, there's different kinds of waters. Blue water is the water that comes out of your tap. Gray water is the water that goes down your tap, and there's a whole level of work that's now emerging around reuse in gray water, particularly when we have such dramatic scarcity issues around the world. Black water is the water that goes down the toilet. Stormwater goes down your stormwater drains. Rainwater comes from above, and foundational water comes from your aquifers. And there's huge issues with aquifer management around the globe, including salination. Before I do this, I'm going to take the screen back, and I just wanted to kind of make some observations. Okay, I hope you can see me now. I wanted to talk a little bit about, kind of give an overview of what this means and what some of the basics are on this. For something that's so basic, water gets very little attention. It's a very complex issue. As I noted, it's tied to not only agriculture, energy, but also urbanization, health, natural resource management, and economic growth. Now, there's a lot of verbiage out there, and one of the big ones you're going to hear, it's been 10 years since an anniversary where water was declared as a human right. It sounds very basic, it sounds like a very nice thing, but it's actually incredibly complex. There were a number of countries and partners that were opposed to that declaration. And to be very honest with you, in many ways, it's more of a hindrance than a help to the sector, and I'll go on with that in a couple minutes. It's huge in terms of the health and disease issues with cholera, schistosomiasis, diarrhea, and stunting. Stunting affects 144 million children, and that's across income levels. So when I was living in Bangladesh, where water contamination is a huge issue, the stunting of children cuts across income levels because of the urbanization issue. It affects everywhere. We have the long-term impact on health, and we'll talk a little bit about this when we go to the slides in terms of droughts and floods. I want to touch on water and COVID. We've been monitoring this very closely since March, and we're seeing drops in revenue just on the utilities side, anywhere between 10 and 70%. So that's water utilities who are losing revenue because local authorities or governments are putting a hold on bills. Water is one of two ways that you can mitigate the crisis. You can do social distancing, which in high density, low income communities is extremely difficult. And the alternative is washing your hands. But of course, if you don't have access to water, that gets very, very difficult. which is why around the world, utilities are being asked to reconnect people who were cut off for lack of payment, or also expanding the services they provide. And that's another aspect of the increased costs. So we're seeing not only a drop in revenue, but increased costs due to chemicals, due to new water points being put in low-income communities, and additional water tanker services that are going in around the globe. So one aspect that I've been working on the last 5 or 6 months is really looking at the issue on how this is impacting water utilities, how we can get them the resources to keep the taps running, and then how we can do the institutional reforms to make them more sustainable over time. Pollution is a huge issue. 80% of wastewater, this is the water that comes out of your toilet, is discharged without any treatment at all. None. Very scary stuff when you see that. It's higher in low-income countries. Discharge from farming and nitrates also has a major impact on health issues. Climate change is having major impacts on water. For a long time, water was not considered part of the whole climate change debate, but that's changed rather dramatically. I can talk a little bit more about that later. The diet, in terms of meat production, you've seen the tables and the amount of water that's needed to produce almonds and meats and other things along that line, and all that's very true. I also want to talk about electricity. 10% of the world's water is used, electricity is used to move water around, just moving it around through transmission and distribution. And the link between water and electricity is very extensive. I'll highlight on that a little bit as well. Unlike power and energy, I think water has yet to transform how the sector operates. I was involved in the energy sector earlier in my career, and what's gone on with wind and solar and geothermal is really transformed the sector, brought down rates, and yet tariffs remain very, very high. Water, we've seen some changes, but not to the same extent that I think we've seen in the energy sector. Reuse, I touched on, that's a major issue. And just looking at this region, we're not yet adapting and using our gray water. It's kind of thought that we have a lot of water in this region because of the Chesapeake Bay. I don't profess to be an expert on the US at all, certainly not in the region. It's been noted by others that I sometimes act like I'm a visitor than living here. And I really do not understand what goes on in this region, but I know from other regions, even where there is a sense that there is a lot of water, it's not always fresh water, and the costs with producing it and cleaning it are exorbitant. So the whole issue of reuse is really becoming quite an issue. Lastly, before I go back to the slides, I'm going to talk on this issue of financing, and I spend a lot of time on this. So this is a little bit where my passion is and expertise is. Someone has said that water is the most boring business in the world. You put in infrastructure, that infrastructure can last for 100 years. DC Water issued a couple of years ago a 100-year bond. It was the first 100-year bond for infrastructure anywhere in the world. And you sit back and you send out bills and you get paid. And the reality is we only have 3 sources of income to pay for water. You can get money through your tariffs, and those tariffs in most of the OECD countries, the middle and upper income countries, or the upper income countries, I should say, covers both sanitation and water. So, and in most of our environments, those tariffs cover nearly all or most of the water-related costs. That's for the operations, the maintenance, and any debt service for the infrastructure we have. So one source is your tariffs. The other source is transfers, and that can be donor money from the World Bank, the African Development Bank, any number of bilateral donors. And then the third is coming from the government. And that's how water is primarily funded. in most emerging markets. It comes from central government and they pay for the infrastructure. Tariffs are paid in many countries, but they do not cover O&M, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So that's just an overview on kind of what some of the challenges are in the sector. And now I'm going to go back to the slides and try to touch on a couple. I'm going to start with a few water facts. There's a couple pages of these, so bear with me. And I want to give you a sense of this. This goes back to some of the challenges I talked about. So we presently have almost 2.5 billion people living with access to improved sanitation facilities. Someone before we came on noted that sanitation was a bigger problem than water, and that is absolutely true. You have nearly 700 million people who are not receiving their drinking water from improved sources. So they're drinking from polluted areas. You have almost 900 million people who are practicing still, in this day and age, still practicing open defecation. You have 3 billion people who lack water and soap in their residence, and 900 million children who go to schools without water and soap at those facilities. And water is a huge challenge, not only in emerging markets, but if you go to Arizona and look in California and other parts of the developed world, you'll see major water challenges out there. Okay. Hydropower provides about 16% of the world's energy. And we actually do quite a bit of work. I didn't mention dams and dam safety. Dams are very controversial. There are a number of our donors who refuse to approve our projects or abstain from projects in terms of financing dams, but they are a major source of water. I mentioned earlier that 10% of the energy in the world is used to move water. California, that figure is almost 20%. We looked at the public money going in, and we looked at a number of countries outside of China in India. And we found that 60% of the public resources that were going into water were benefiting the top 20% income strata. So the money that we have, we're not using effectively and efficiently. Subsidies total about $320 billion a year. That excludes China and India, as I mentioned, and this equates to about 0.5% of GDP, and in lower income countries, it's even larger. On the health side, 1 in 4 healthcare facilities around the world lack basic water and water services, and 1 in 5 have no toilets or sanitation facilities. Those are healthcare facilities. Diarrheal diseases account for 1 in 9 child deaths worldwide. It's the 2nd largest cause of death among children under the age of 5. And yet these investments have a huge payoff, not only in terms of health, but also in job creation, in agriculture, in urbanization, and in terms of economic development. So $1 invested in water yields a return of about $25. And in terms of food, we're seeing that because of urbanization and because of salination, we're seeing aquifers on coastal areas in Africa, in Asia, and in the US, having seawater infiltration, which of course then means the treatment process gets much more expensive. The high sophistication that's going on in terms of agriculture has had a huge impact in food production, but it also has an impact on our environment and our water supply. So we're seeing that nitrate having a major impact on stunting and also on the economic earnings of adults over their lifetime. Not surprising, women are responsible in areas where water is not hooked up to the house for collecting it in off premises. And in terms of regions, the ones that we're seeing most at risk are the Middle East and Sahel and Africa. They could see their GDP growth rates drop by about 6% by 2050 due to water-related impacts on agriculture, health, and the economies that they're involved in. So fairly grim. I've talked about the various types of water there are, the types of challenges that we're facing, and the impact in terms of health and the economy. I want to kind of talk about the solution. And there is a solution. I know this sounds very grim, but I think we know what to do. The issue is we're not doing it, and we're not doing it for a number of reasons. There is no doubt that climate change is accelerating the water emergency. So we have too much water in terms of flooding. Flooding accounts for nearly half of all weather-related disasters. It's affecting about 2.3 billion people. We have huge issues on droughts. About 60% of the world population lives in drought-stressed basins, and droughts regularly affect about 55 million people annually. And we're losing the quality water that we have to pollution. I mentioned the 80% figures not being treated. I talked about COVID already. The challenges on revenue and expenses is growing. We're seeing a lot of the requests coming into the IMF. Someone mentioned the IMF looking at supporting water services. And water is both, we're arguing very strongly that while the emphasis is on health, water and sanitation and hygiene are equally important to that. It's not only necessary for the short-term response, but for the long-term response as well. If we're going to beat the virus, we're going to need to keep providing water services. And as you saw, the numbers of people who are getting those services are not nearly enough. So how does this look? We break it down to water for people, water for production, and water for the planet. I'm going to go through this part of it very quickly because I notice we're already at 7:30 and I want to give plenty of time. And I do want to talk, I know Rotary is interested in water and sanitation in particular, and I want to talk about that in some detail. So I'm briefly going to run through these next set of slides in terms of water for people. I mentioned that about a third of the global population lacks safely managed water, and an even larger portion lacks sanitation facilities, and you only look at about 1 in 4 healthcare facilities having basic water. And I mentioned also 900 million people who are still practicing open defecation. In terms of production, 90% of the global power generation in some form or fashion is water intensive. And the impact on agriculture industry accounts for about 20% of the world's withdrawal, and agriculture accounts for 70 or 80% of the freshwater use. The environment and the whole freshwater aspect of it, our freshwater supply only accounts for about 2.5% of all the water that we have on this planet. And we're not treating it very well, and we're not using it very efficiently. At the same time, it has a huge impact on the biodiversity that's surrounding us, and it's under an unprecedented threat. And much of that biodiversity is underwater. I'm not going to go through this slide. I've hit on many of these numbers. So, in what to do? Given your interest in water and sanitation, I'll go on this slide a little deeper. We need to do more in terms of our wastewater treatment. That means, as someone mentioned, the whole issue of sustainability. It's very easy to build a water treatment plant. It's not easy, but we know how to do it. The difficulty is maintaining it. I'll give you an example. Another sector, but I've seen it in water as well. I lived in Kenya for many years and have worked there for over 30 years. And arguably the road from Mombasa, which is the major port in East Africa, to Nairobi is the most vital piece of infrastructure in East Africa. When I first came out to Kenya went to Kenya in 1988, the World Bank was busy expanding that road and building it. 10 years later, I was living in Kenya again. and the African Development Bank basically was rehabbing that road completely. And 10 years after that, I was working in Kenya again, and the Chinese are now rebuilding that road. So, and the life of a road is not 10 years. So we are not maintaining the infrastructure that we have. There are huge issues around that. We see huge challenges around 24/7 water supply and sanitation services. Many parts of the world do not have that supply, and it has a major impact on the infrastructure. The pressure from pipes going on and off causes huge leaks. In the business, we call it non-revenue water, but it is leaks. And in some places in the world, non-revenue water can account for 60 or 70% of the water. That's fresh water going through pipes that is lost. That is literally pouring money down the drain. We need service providers, utilities who have technical skills and can perform their jobs without political interference. A very popular thing during elections is to lower water tariffs, which are already very, very low. So our service providers need to be run well and technically and financially efficient, and our governance arrangements need to be clear. I've talked about COVID already and the impact there, so I won't go on about that. I'm not going to focus on production. Lots of issues here, particularly around climate change, evaporation, agriculture, and irrigation. We're really, there's a lot more scope for irrigation, and we're not doing it well. We're not charging farmers for irrigation infrastructure in general, which is why it's not being rolled out at the level that we probably need, and the consequences in terms of climate change I already touched on that. I want to jump, to water and sanitation, because there was a great deal of interest on that, and I want to touch on that. And I really want to come back to this notion of water as a human right. And the way we pay for water and sanitation infrastructure, as I mentioned in most developed countries, is your tariffs, the bill you get from Fairfax Water. If you look at it carefully, you'll see a charge for water supply and sanitation. And it's cheap. It's cheap compared to your electricity bill. This notion of water as a human right has raised an issue, because some people are saying, well, it's a human right, it should be free. I've been advocating throughout my career that we have the ability in our tariffs to cover the operation of the system as well as the infrastructure. However, and I've gotten in trouble in a couple places around the world when I've said this, if there's a public policy decision that should not be the case, that water should be free, and I want to be very clear, I don't advocate that, then we have to have the discussion. When we talk about universal access to healthcare, the health professionals get together and they go to the Ministry of Finance and they make an argument for those resources, and a policy and program is put into place. When you do pre-K or higher education, education professionals come together, they sit with the Ministry of Finance, they allocate resources, and you implement a program. For some reason in the water sector, we cannot get past this notion or this cliche that water is a human right. If there is a public policy decision that water needs to be free or subsidized, we have an obligation to come together and go off to the Ministry of Finance and make the argument for those resources. And for whatever reason, we very rarely do that. It's one of the great mysteries in the sector for me, and I don't fully understand why. But if we're going to deal with this, we have to get the resources that we need to close this gap. We also have to use the resources that we currently have and that we are advocating for in the future much more effectively and much more efficiently. So I'm going to talk about something called the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I won't go into this. Some of you may be aware of them. It's a UN effort that looked at how do we move development along. So for the next 10 years, we need about $115 billion per year just on water and sanitation. And this table breaks out the difference between rural and urban and water and sanitation. So the need is much greater in sanitation in urban areas and in rural areas than water. And you'll see that in the table on the right. And then if you look at the parts of the world where it's needed, it's primarily in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, but other parts of the world also need that. The bottom line is, despite our goal of universal access of safely managed water and sanitation, we're not going to meet it. We're absolutely not going to meet it, no matter what we do in the next 10 years. And I'm usually an optimist, but the resources have not been put into it, and the sector is not transformed in the way we need to move forward. Our tariffs generally, in most parts of the world, are extremely low. And the perception is, if water is a human right and people are poor, they cannot pay for water. And if that's the case and you buy that, then the public sector and the fiscus and the Ministry of Finance needs to come in and cover those sources. I talked about the sources of income. It's really either going to come from the Treasury or it's going to come from tariffs. There is no other source of revenue to deal with this issue in water and sanitation. And we need to improve our ability to attract commercial finance. Now, the sector is, there's quite a bit of controversy in the sector, and there has been over the last 30 years about public-private partnerships. This goes a little bit to the water as a human right. The private sector shouldn't be coming in and running water utilities or providing water services. The bank, my employer, at one point was a strong advocate of this. At this point, both professionally and personally, we're agnostic on how you provide those sources. Someone has described me once as a reformed PPP person, public-private partnership. I'm really agnostic on how we finance the sector. We just have to bring more money in. The problem is compounded. Up until COVID, there was more than enough money out there to attract. We did not have commercially viable projects that could be put out there. Our project preparation was not able to deliver infrastructure that could be reimbursed through bonds, through loans, or through management contracts or public-private partnerships. It wasn't, so the point I'm trying to make is this wasn't a money issue. Rather, it was an issue that our service providers, the utilities, were not technically and financially efficient. And we're blessed in the sector because we have a number of key performance indicators. You can go online, the bank runs a database of 5,000 utilities, and you can look at the water utility in Manila, and you can look at the water utility in Lima, and you can look at the number of employees per 10,000 customers, non-revenue water, collection rates, all kinds of things. Those KPIs were not performing at a point where the utilities themselves were viable economically and technically. At the same time, our institutional arrangements are not very clear and transparent. That's not just regulation, that's the governance arrangements, that's the ownership arrangements. Those are not clear. And those two factors are undermining the efficiency of the sector and ultimately the creditworthiness. So we're not able to attract the money. Now, again, if you can't bring private money in, that private money, whether it's pension funds, insurance companies, or service providers, it can only be repaid by those two sources, tariffs or money from the Treasury. So as a result of this, we see what we call the slippery slope of inefficient service providers. And I won't go into all of these, but it happens incredibly quickly. It is amazing. I've seen well-run utilities deteriorate in a period of 18 to 24 months. And the cost of coming back vastly outweighs the cost of maintaining the services. But we're not using the resources effectively to address this concern. So small incremental delays in maintenance and operation can have a huge impact on systematic failures. And I want to kind of touch, this is an oversimplification, but I want to kind of highlight a solution. So we looked at about 700 utilities around the globe. and we tried to look at who was viable. And viable meant who was covering their operation and maintenance and could cover some kind of debt service for their infrastructure, which is the way we do it in most of the OECD countries. And we found initially that only 15% of them were viable. If you simply collected all of the tariffs that were on the books, so no tariff increase at all, that jumped by almost another 15%. So it doubled. You didn't have to change anything except collect resources that were available already on the books in the tariff approved by the regulator. If you reduced energy costs, and this is a promising thing, if you could reduce them by 15%, it increased by another 15%. So it went from almost 30% to a little over 40%. The big investment that we need is to close the leaks. If you reduce non-revenue water to a standard of about 25%, that means 25% of the water going through the system is lost. That almost doubles by 25%. The increases by 25% for these utilities. And then based on that, if you were to increase tariffs, or able to increase tariffs, and we don't advocate increasing tariffs without improvements in service delivery, you get up to almost 80%. So we know what to do. This is not easy. It takes political leadership, it takes money, it takes reprioritization of resources, but we basically know how to get there. And with that, you can see more investment in capital. You can look at better asset management, so the infrastructure that's in place. You can certainly reduce non-revenue water, improve your collection rates. You can reduce energy costs. We're seeing a number of opportunities around the globe to move from diesel to solar pumps. I was involved in a project in northern Somalia where we were retrofitting out diesel. The utility was spending 90% of their money on buying diesel and getting diesel in. And by bringing in pumps, they were able to expand this, double the scope of the system. We need to maximize reuse of water and look at gray water opportunities, which are quite large. And when I say gray water, I don't mean drinking it, I do mean using it in agriculture. And then we see opportunities for more professionalization of the staff and greater efficiency on our governance and institutional arrangements. So going back to my main messages, we need to make water, we need to recognize the importance of it. We need to recognize we have a water crisis. We have plenty of resources, technology, and knowledge in order to deal with it, but we need to reprioritize our objectives and the resources, and we really need to start looking at political leadership to make this a priority. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to take any questions, or someone can say I'm wrong on some of this. I often am. And as I said, I'm not an expert on all aspects of water. And I may tell you I don't know and promise to come back to you. So thanks for this opportunity. I hope it was helpful and of interest. And I'll take a couple questions, I guess, and then try to address them. So thank you.
Thank you, Joel. I'm going to ask people to raise their hand if they can, if they want to ask a question. There's a lot of information there. So.
And I'm happy to answer it on Africa as well.
Okay. Well, Joel, I will ask the first question then. I actually work for an agency in the United States, the Rural Utility Service, whose one of our functions is water to rural America.
Right.
So I certainly appreciate what you're going through. I mean, we're a wealthy country and we still have people who do not have running water. What we have done, though, is we have what we call circuit riders to handle the professionalization issue. So we, as part of the sustainability, we fund projects, but they can't afford to have a full-time person. So we have worked with National Rural Water Association and another entity to have people who will ride the circuit between 3, 4, 5, 6 different water systems to keep them running. Is there anything similar on an international scale?
Sure. Do you want to? Okay, let me address that one. So we, as a bank, people like to borrow money for infrastructure, and I should say our money for lower income countries is very concessional. It's about 70 basis points, and that can go out for 40 years. So this is not commercial money by any means. Having said that, governments like to borrow money for infrastructure. What you're referring to is really the technical assistance and capacity building. And we find basically that governments don't like to borrow for that. So we have to find resources elsewhere. And this think tank that I work on in the bank actually does a lot of that work. We do it at the subnational level, at the national level, regionally, and globally. And we try to address the biggest challenges. So our staff working on our projects are also doing this analytical work, and they identify these challenges at certain levels and then put money in. So on an average bank project, we would spend 2 to 5% of the money on this technical advisory services, which is not nearly enough. Now the bilateral donors, whether it be USAID or the Germans, the Dutch, their money tends to be grant money, and we try to collaborate them as closely as we can to come up with a common agenda and work together. Generally, having been on it with a bilateral donor before, when I did technical assistance work then, I find it's much more effective when it's paired now with lending at the same time. So we have a unique opportunity amongst the multilateral development banks to bring the technical assistance and the infrastructure investment together, as opposed to just doing the technical assistance. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. I saw Max was unmuted earlier. Max, did you have a question?
Yeah. Did you?
No.
Hi, this is Nasreen. I really thank you for this beautiful and very informative and eye-opening talk. And I also want to thank Sarah Shannon for arranging it. But I am a little bit confused about when you talk about fresh water, is that the rain? Where is the role of rain in water supply? And I have been reading about countries going without water in the very near future and losing millions of people as a result of thirst, not being able to provide them. Is there a connection? Is this true? Am I confused?
So droughts are having huge impacts around the world as the climate is changing. So there's no doubt about that. In terms of fresh water, so water that you drink basically comes from two sources. It comes from rainwater down into rivers or surface water from the rain, or it can come from aquifers. And one of the problems with urbanization and the change in the environment is we are depleting the aquifers to the point that there are two types of aquifers. There's surface aquifers and there's antique aquifers, which are very low, and those do not get recharged. And in many parts of the world, we're now depleting those as well. So the amount of fresh water we have is absolutely depleting. You'll hear a lot globally around desalination. It is the efficiency of it is increasing, but it's still very expensive. It's very energy intensive, and there are huge environmental byproducts from the desalination process that are not being addressed. They're being put back into our oceans and causing some problems. So desal has been very popular in the MENA region, in the Middle East. I've done work in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis are planning a massive influx of desal. The problem is they're going to end up spending a great deal of their energy, oil, producing water instead of exporting it. So desal is an opportunity, but reuse is also an opportunity. So the gray water that I was referring that comes out of our taps, that can be used in agriculture. And if you looked at one of the first slides, I said 70 or 80% of fresh water is currently being used in agriculture. Instead of that fresh water, we could use gray water in agriculture. So there's a lot of opportunities out here. I don't mean to be negative, but we have to use and program our water much more effectively and efficiently than we're currently doing.
Joel, I have about 4 more people who are looking for questions. So I'm going to have Nisa or Roger go first, then Janetta, then Andrew, and then David.
That's fine, and I can take notes if you want to have everyone go back to back.
So we'll go ahead and let's go ahead with Nisa, Roger, if they wanted to ask a question.
The question I was going to raise, I think you sort of addressed it already. 70 or 80% of the water is used in agriculture. There's certainly efficiencies of using less water in agriculture. I'm sure some of it's lost and wasted, and the use of gray water in agriculture. But the gray water is probably collected at a different point than where you're going to need to use it, since it's probably urban waste and you're going to want to take it to the countryside. So, but you've sort of partially answered that question. If you want to elaborate further, I think it's.
Sure. I mean, gray water is an infrastructure issue. You know, we have water coming from rural areas into our cities through transmission lines. What we really need to do is look at a way to assure the quality, which would be lower than drinking water, but also then transmit it back out to agriculture. And it really depends on the region. I mean, you have urban settings very close to agricultural production where that's doable. And that's part of the efficiency we have to get to. Thanks.
Okay, Janetta.
Hi, Joel. Thank you so much for your presentation. Could you speak a bit more to the grassroots challenges of improving operational efficiency as it relates to grassroots challenges on the continent of Africa when working directly in the villages and communities on the ground?
Okay. I can come back to that. Why don't we take a couple, Janetta? Thank you. Great question.
Okay, and Andrew Wade. Next, you had a question.
Piggyback on the hold on. I would just piggyback on the last one, just about the grassroots level, because what we're working on is much smaller scale than anything you're talking about. But I didn't really think about it like you said it, but I kind of agree. Like the thing about the free, water should be free. I have to say that in the small scale we worked on it, some of the successful projects have been when they maybe charge a little fee to the parents and students to have some, I don't know if we want to call it skin in the game. And then those are the projects that are still working after, in our case, 8 or 10 years, but some of the ones that they don't expect anything and anyone could come up and use the system, and the system breaks down because it's got unlimited use and there's no one really there to take care of it. So I kind of, again, you're talking about this much larger than anything we're working on. But we found that we do get, when the other parties have more skin in the game, then the projects are more successful. So I agree with that kind of theory.
Okay. David Feld.
Hello, Joe. My wife is in Kiswahili. I lived in Kenya for 3 years. Water systems. Tell me what the role of bottled water for drinking water. I mean, that seems to be a good, low available solution, at least for drinking water. Is that being used? Tell me about it.
Okay, that's 3 questions for you.
Okay. All right. Bottled water is very controversial. It is cheaper and much more efficient to get your drinking water from a system. Obviously, those systems are not available everywhere. And as a result, people drink bottled water. If we, it's necessary. We have issues in some places about the monopolization of the source. We also have issues sometimes with issues of transportation. I was in Fiji working at the end of last year, and I am amazed to see Fiji water here, the costs associated with it, and the degradation of the water system and with salination because of the islands. I'm not picking on Fiji water. Please don't think I'm telling you not to go out and buy it. But it is kind of shocking what some of this is related to. Some other people, not I, have referred to it as a necessary evil. The necessity is that because of the lack of efficiency and the lack of capital and the lack of expertise that I've been referring to, people can't take water out of the taps. When I first moved to Kenya, we could drink water out of the tap back in 1988. You can't do that today. So the degradation of the system is necessitating the need for bottled water. It's not the most efficient way to do it. It's still not the most cost efficient way to do it, but it is, as some other people have said, a necessary evil. On Jeanette and Andrew's question about kind of rural water and the operating efficiency. So the operating efficiency of water systems is consistent around the world. And I mentioned, and I can share, there's something called IBNet, which is this database of 5,000 utilities, and it has all the benchmarks that you can look at. The Israelis are very, very efficient in their water systems. They have some of the most expensive water in the world. Their non-revenue water rate, along with Singapore and a couple other countries, is around 7 or 8%. In that slide, I mentioned that the target we look for, depending on where you are, is about 25%. Now, if you're sitting in the middle of the Sahel, 25% is too high. If you're sitting on Lake Erie, you might be able to get away with a higher rate than that. So the operating efficiency is well known around water and sanitation. Sanitation is harder. And we haven't talked much about sanitation, but the challenges there are really the networks are in place to produce the treatment of the collection and treatment of sanitation are hugely expensive, outrageous. So the way we do this in emerging markets, we can't go in and put entire systems in anymore. It's just cost prohibitive. So we have to look at a multiples of ways to do this. They have to be closed systems, but the closed systems have to be transported. You need to bring in, take the septic out and remove it to a treatment facility. Unfortunately, there's costs with that. And if you're in a low-income community, it's much easier to go on the side of a river and dump it there than go to the treatment facility, and that's a real problem. That's why we have such high rates of open defecation, for example. So the whole, I guess the point I want to make to you is we know what an efficient operation looks like for both water and sanitation. We're not puzzled on what to do with it. We know what that looks like. And how to deal with this in Africa and in rural areas in particular. And I think rural is the key thing. And I would argue it's very similar across the globe. It's not just an Africa problem. But the points that you raised were in some ways you've answered the question. There's an issue of skills. So people, the engineering around water supply and identifying it and the treatment of sanitation. You have issues of revenue. You have issues of sustainability. It's not easy to build a system, but it's very, very difficult to maintain it. We are constantly looking at sustainability issues on water pumps. Huge issues there in terms of the O&M, the operation and maintenance on water pumps. It's a huge challenge. We know how to fix it. When we put it together a project, we make sure that the revenue is there, either from tariffs or from the government, but priorities change and sometimes the money doesn't get where it's supposed to be. And then you have issues around urbanization. So what could have been a rural area or a peri-urban area with some of the population growth rates, particularly that we're seeing in South Asia and in Africa, quickly becomes an urban area and the infrastructure can't handle those systems. So there's multiple challenges there. Again, I think we broadly know what to do. We just have to prioritize it and find the political leadership to make it happen. And I realize that sounds much simpler than than it is. It's a huge challenge, but you know, it's over the 15-year period to get universal access for water and sanitation. I think the figure is about $1.6 trillion. It sounds like an enormous amount of money, okay? But if you look at what we put in other sectors, or as individuals buying dog food or other things, it's not such a big figure. We can do this. We just have to reprioritize if that's a priority going forward. Part of the problem is it's not always a priority because particularly in rural areas, people dig a hole and they can often find water. So, you know, the people who are dying of a lack of water in the grand scheme are not particularly large. You see it, you hear about it, but they're pockets rather than a long-term issue. And the longer-term issue is what we're really facing here. I hope that answers your questions.
Thank you. Jim Holcomb has the final question, and then we'll turn it back to Sarah.
My question was, you were right about it's really not a question, it's a comment. I lived in Asia for 20 years in the late 70s and early 90s. Some of the countries you talked about, Philippines, Indonesia, India. And I ran pharmaceutical companies, but we owned a company called Zempro, a Wisconsin company. And it was a turnkey water company where you could sell to a government and you could take sludge and drink it at the end. The problem was they wouldn't invest in that. So the technology was there even then. It was the financial will to install those situations. And the only country that was willing to do that to get their water level better, higher, or whatever the standard term would be, was Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's worth pointing out that the water that comes out of a water treatment plant is often drinkable. The problem is in the transmission and the distribution where you have pipes and leakage and pressure issues, and that's where the water becomes undrinkable going forward. So, you know, this is partly an infrastructure problem, but also an institution. We often say, you know, it's not about fixing the pipes, it's about fixing the institutions that fix the pipes.
Joel, can I have one more?
Sure.
Just, I mean, again, you're talking about very big things. It's a very powerful presentation. And I think I understand the bigger problem more. Let's just pretend you're getting ready to retire and get out of the big, you know, literally. And then you had, I don't know, $40,000, $50,000, $100,000 to do a project in Kenya, South Africa, and Fiji. What would you spend that $40,000, $50,000, $100,000 on? Because that's where we are.
Boy, look, it's a huge challenge, and I, you know, you're not very far from where we are on some of our projects. I mean, we do have a portfolio of rural water and sanitation projects spread across a number of different countries. Look, you know, I would almost ditch my current kind of thinking, and I would go back almost to the Peace Corps kind of approach. And it's really at the community level. You have to find leadership that wants this to happen, that's willing to take ownership, and that's willing to be there to maintain the system over time. And I think that's the only way these modest investments in water infrastructure work. It's not about necessarily the country per se, and it's not even the region. It's really the local area and how that local leadership is going to manage it. The problem is that people change. You know, people die, people move, new leaders come in, and it's not always a sustainable system. Now, that works both ways. You can get new leadership in and reinvigorate it. On your issue earlier about paying for it, somebody has to pay for it. You're absolutely right. I think we generally find if people are paying for water, they take it a little bit more seriously, particularly in small closed systems that aren't part of a national grid. But if a public policy is there to make water free, And some governments do that. Tariffs are very, very, I showed a slide with tariffs. Tariffs can be exceedingly low in some countries. The problem is when tariffs are very low and the fiscus is not coming in and paying for that service.
Wow.
Sarah.
Okay, so Joel, thank you so much for taking the time and doing a wonderful presentation. And thank you to everybody else that participated. And I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I hope to see you back in the next quarter. Okay.
Sarah, Sarah, can I interrupt one thing?
Sure.
My wife just told me I may not have answered Jeanette's question about the grassroots. Jeanette, I thought I did, but if I didn't, I'm happy to explain further offline or wherever. I know it's Saturday night, people have other things to do. Sarah can give you my contact details, but obviously I'm very invested in Africa. It's the home, it's where most of my children were either born or have deep roots, and I'm happy to talk about that further. So I hope I didn't slight you by any means. That wasn't my intention.
We'll keep this open a little while longer so that people can ask questions, but I ask everyone to unmute and say thank you to for the.
Thank you, Joel.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very good.
This was excellent.
Excellent
Good
job.
presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Usually we give the
Thanks, Sarah.
speaker.
Good job, Sarah.
Thanks very much. I very much appreciate it. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
I'll leave it open for a little while for those who want to stay on.
Okay, and I can stay on if you want as well.
Yeah. So Janetta or anyone who had a couple questions, you're.
Hey, Joe, I got a question. This is Dennis.
Hi.
Hi, you were talking about the gray water and the black water, and I was trying to get my head around that because to me that would involve a whole nother set of plumbing systems.
Right.
And that ain't cheap. The only other time I've ever heard about it was the RV industry.
So when you're putting in an existing system, when you're putting in a new system, you do it at the same time. That's the way to do it. And you have to retrofit. I mean, there are some people who are putting it into their homes. So you put a tank down below and you use it on the garden. There's any number of ways that it can be done. Sometimes it needs to be treated. There's different kinds of gray water and different levels of gray water. So you're right, there's costs associated with it, but the reality is we're running out of fresh water. And with 80% of fresh water going to agriculture, agriculture can often use gray water. So we're going to be forced to look at this over time. Some regions, it's going to be more possible than others.
Thanks. Thank you. Anybody else?
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, Joel, thank you so much for taking the time to answer my question. I would love to hear how you would respond further to that question on improving operational efficiency at a grassroots level.
Okay, so I think there's generally two things. I had a slide up there, but let me go into more detail. So let's talk about the service provider itself, whether it's a local government, whether it's a utility, or whether it's a community organization like that the Rotary might fund, okay? There are matrices of what you would look at on the efficiency of that, and that's what you have to focus on. So if non-revenue water, if you're building a closed system in a rural area and you have leaks where you're losing 50 or 70% of the water, you have a problem. And that's where, picking up on Andrew's question, that's where I would put the money, fix the leaks, okay? On the same time, if you're running a rural system and you are sending out bills and you're only collecting 50% of the revenue, that's another place I would put the money. So you have to focus on these key performance indicators that water service providers use around the globe, whether it's in Sao Paulo, which is one of the largest water utilities in the world, or a rural village in Western Kenya. Doesn't matter. You have to focus on these key performance indicators going forward. And there's about 30 of them around the world, and you can see this online that you would look at for those matrices. The other side of it which in many ways, the efficiency is tough, but the more difficult thing is these governance and institutional arrangements. If you're in a rural area, you know, who is the committee that's running it? Who's responsible? Is there an advisory board? Is there a governance board? If you're looking at a major urban area, is it professional? Is it ring fenced from the local government? In many countries, we see where the water utility or the water department is part of local government. In a lot of places, the water department is a cash cow and money is taken out of water and put into other municipal services. It's why we sometimes recommend for a corporatization. That's not a privatization. That means you ring fence the utility or the service provider, and then you have to come up with governance arrangements for that. Those governance arrangements can include who owns the water service provider. And this is an issue, again, whether you're in this rural area or you're in a major urban area. Who owns the water utility? How is it being managed, both at a technical level, and then how is it being managed in terms of governance? And then there's the regulatory questions. And the regulatory questions are not only about prices, but there's the quality of water too. So I think the answer to your question, even though you framed it in the rural context, the answer is kind of global. You need to look at the technical and financial efficiency of the provider, and you need to look at the governance, institutional, and regulatory arrangements around it. The problem, and this is the last time I'm going to talk about the problem around this, is you can create those systems. I've worked on water acts and water laws around the world, but you have to maintain integrity. You have to maintain them. You know, we've talked a little bit about Kenya. After the last election, the governors who were newly installed in many cases fired the boards and the managers of the water utilities. According to the Water Act, they did not have that authority. And that made the service providers, despite all the other issues, if you were going to invest in that from the private sector, there's no way you're going to do that now because people aren't following the rules. So it's quite simple. You have to set the rules, and in a lot of places those rules aren't set, but you also have to make sure that you maintain the integrity of those rules going forward. I hope that answered your question. And it's not just rural. This is across the board on water and sanitation.